No one at the Oakhaven livestock auction blinked when Harlan Tate bought 5,000 prime broilers. But when Cora Vance raised her paddle for the cull crates, 400 splay-legged, half-bald runts destined for the incinerator, the auctioneer stopped talking. A collective scoff rippled through the bleachers. Cora just wrote the check. The auction barn smelled of ammonia, damp sawdust, and stale black coffee. It was a smell deeply ingrained in the fabric of Oakhaven, a town where you were only as good as your last yield. Down in the pit, the auctioneer's voice was a rhythmic, unintelligible drone, a machine gun of numbers that dictated who would eat steak this winter, and who would be boiling soup bones. Cora Vance sat in the third row. Her boots were patched with roofing tar. Her denim jacket was frayed at the cuffs, holding the chill of the early April morning. She hadn't come to buy prime stock. She didn't have the capital. Her checking account held exactly $112, a sum that had to stretch across diesel, property taxes, and her own groceries for the next 3 weeks. Lot 42 was wheeled into the center ring. They weren't even in proper cages. They were crammed into plastic transport crates, stacked 4 high. These were the rejects from the massive commercial hatcheries a county over. The runts, the crossbeaks, the splay-legged, birds with crooked spines and bald patches where the stress had caused them to pull out their own down. They were a liability to the industrial sheds, destined for the incinerator, because they couldn't pack on 4 pounds of watery meat in 6 weeks. "All right, boys, clearing the floor," the auctioneer drawled, wiping his brow. "Got a load of culls here. Feed company won't touch 'em. Looking for $20 for the whole pallet. $20. Who's taking the trash out today?" Silence hung in the dusty air. Men in branded feed caps looked at their phones. Harlan Tate, the owner of the local commercial poultry operation, leaned against the railing, picking his teeth with a matchstick. He bought birds by the thousand. He didn't look twice at a crate of dying runts. Cora raised her paddle. "Number 71. The auctioneer blinked. He stopped his rhythmic chant. He looked at Cora, then down at his ledger, then back at Cora. "I got 20. Do I hear 25? No? Sold to the Vance farm for a $20 bill." A low murmur rippled through the bleachers. A few men chuckled. Cora didn't flush. She didn't look around. She stood up, walked down the wooden steps, and handed over a crisp $20 bill at the clerk's desk. Harlan Tate intercepted her at the loading dock. He was a big man, smelling of expensive cologne and cheap chewing tobacco. "You running a hospice for poultry now, Cora?" Harlan asked, his voice booming enough to ensure the men loading feed bags nearby could hear. "Those birds won't make it a week. You're throwing good money after bad. Your daddy would be spinning in his grave seeing you waste dollars on dead weight." Cora tightened her grip on the handle of the first crate. The plastic dug into a calloused palm. "My dad went bankrupt buying your premium feed for birds that died of heart attacks before they saw the sun, Harlan. Excuse me." She loaded the crates into the bed of her rusted F-150. The suspension groaned under the meager weight. As she pulled out of the gravel lot, she checked the rearview mirror. Harlan was still standing there, shaking his head. The drive back to the Vance property took 20 minutes. It was a sprawling 40 acres of exhausted soil and a decaying, overgrown apple orchard. Her grandfather had planted the trees. Her father had let them go wild in favor of massive, climate-controlled poultry barns that now stood empty, their corrugated tin roofs rusting into a dull orange. Cora parked by the edge of the orchard. The grass here was thigh-high, choked with wild mustard, dandelion, and fallen, rotting wood. She dropped the tailgate and unlatched the first crate. She reached in and pulled out a pullet. It felt like nothing in her hands. Just brittle bones and a frantically beating heart. Its left leg turned inward at a sharp angle. Its beak was slightly misaligned. She set it on the ground. The bird froze. It had never felt dirt. It had hatched on concrete, moved to wire, and lived its short, miserable life under artificial fluorescent tubes. It stared at the green grass, as if it were an alien landscape. Cora opened the rest of the crates and gently tipped them. 400 crooked, scrawny birds spilled out into the afternoon sun. Some immediately collapsed, their legs too weak to support them. Others huddled in terrified, trembling masses. "All right," Cora muttered to herself, leaning against the truck bed. "You've got dirt. Figure it out." She didn't have money for premium starter crumb. She drove to the local brewery in town and hauled away 50-pound sacks of spent grain they usually threw to the hogs. She bargained with the grocer for bruised cabbage and overripe tomatoes. She mixed it all in a rusted trough at the edge of the orchard, adding crushed oyster shells she scrounged from the coastal road. That first night, a coyote took 12 of them. The cold took another 20. Cora didn't cry. She woke up at dawn, buried the dead under the oldest apple tree, and went back to work. She was running a farm, not a sanctuary. The weak would die. But as she watched the survivors tentatively peck at a wriggling earthworm, a sharp, cynical hope took root in her chest. By late August, the heat in Oakhaven was a physical weight. It pressed down on the asphalt and baked the clay fields until they cracked. In the diner, the hardware store, and the feed shop, the town's verdict on Cora Vance had solidified into a mix of pity and mockery. "She's losing her mind out there," Miller, the hardware store owner, told a customer over the counter. "Comes in here buying wire fencing a yard at a time. Smells like sour mash. I hear she's got those crippled auction birds running loose in the weeds. Harlan says they're mostly dead anyway." They weren't dead. Out of the original 400, 280 had survived. The mortality rate would have sent a commercial farmer into a panic, but Cora had expected it. What she hadn't expected was what happened to the ones that lived. Free from the stifling ammonia of the industrial sheds, the birds changed. They were still ugly. They were a patchwork quilt of mismatched feathers, awkward gaits, and asymmetrical features. But the bent legs had grown thick, roped with tough muscle from navigating the uneven terrain of the orchard. The crossbeaks had learned to scoop up fallen, fermented apples and wild garlic. They didn't waddle. They ran. They leapt into the lower branches of the apple trees to roost away from the foxes. They spent their days aggressively scratching through the dense soil, hunting grubs, beetles, and ticks. They weren't putting on the rapid, watery fat of Harlan's broilers. They were dense, heavy for their size. Cora's daily routine was brutal. She hauled water by hand from the well when the pump failed. She fought off raccoons with a broom handle and a flashlight. Her hands were permanently stained brown from dirt and walnut hulls, her fingernails chipped to the quick. She existed on black coffee and stale toast, pouring every spare cent into securing winter hay and patching the perimeter fence. In October, the first frost hit. The wild mustard died back, turning brown and brittle. The apples finished falling. It was time. Cora selected a rooster. He was one of the ugliest in the flock, a bird with a permanently tilted head and a missing toe. But when she picked him up, he felt like a bowling ball. Solid, resilient. She did the butchering herself behind the barn, out of sight of the road. It was grim, necessary work. When she scalded and plucked the bird, she paused, wiping the sweat from her forehead with the back of a bloody wrist. The carcass looked entirely different from a grocery store chicken. The skin wasn't a pale, sickly white. It was deeply yellow, tinted by months of eating green forage, bugs and marigold petals she'd scattered. The breast wasn't grotesquely inflated. It was proportionate, sloping down to thick, heavily muscled thighs. The meat itself was dark, a deep, rich pink bordering on red. That evening, She stood in her dimly lit kitchen. The linoleum was peeling at the corners. The yellow glow of the overhead bulb reflected off the heavy cast-iron skillet her grandmother had brought from Tennessee. Cora dropped a spoonful of saved bacon lard into the pan. She turned the heat on high until the fat began to shimmer and smoke. She hadn't looked at a recipe. She didn't need one. She quartered the bird. She soaked it briefly in buttermilk left over from a neighbor's trade, then dredged it in flour mixed with heavy black pepper, smoked paprika, and coarse sea salt. She lowered the pieces into the cast iron. The sizzle was loud, violent, and instantly filled the kitchen with an aroma that stopped Cora in her tracks. It didn't smell like the bland, greasy fast food from the highway exits. It smelled sharp, savory. It smelled of rendered fat and toasted spices. But underneath that, there was something deeply earthy. She turned the heat down, letting the thick meat cook through slowly. It took longer than a normal chicken. The muscle was dense. It needed time to break down, time for the fat under the yellow skin to render out and crisp the flour coating into a jagged, golden crust. When it was done, she pulled a thigh from the pan and set it on a wire rack to drain. She didn't bother with a plate or a fork. She waited exactly 2 minutes so she wouldn't burn her mouth, picked up the piece, and took a bite. The crunch echoed in the quiet kitchen. Cora closed her eyes. The flavor hit her like a physical blow. The meat was chewy, yes, demanding to be actively eaten, but the taste was a revelation. It tasted like the orchard. It carried the faint, sweet acidity of the fallen apples, the rich minerality of the dark soil, and the pure, concentrated essence of a life lived outdoors. It was rich, bordering on the deep flavor of pheasant or wild turkey. It was chicken, as it was supposed to taste, before the factories bred the soul out of the animal. She opened her eyes and looked at the remaining pieces in the pan. She thought of Harlan Tate's smug face. She thought of Miller's pitying glances. She thought of her checking account, which now sat at $14. Cora finished the chicken thigh, wiped the grease from her chin, and walked over to the rotary phone on the wall. She was going to host a supper, and she was going to charge for it. Cora didn't have a marketing budget. She had a black Sharpie and a stack of neon yellow printer paper she'd found in her father's old desk. She wrote the same thing on 20 sheets. Vance Farm, Friday night supper, pan-fried chicken, potatoes, greens, $15. Bring your own beer. She drove into Oak Haven on Tuesday. She pinned the first flyer to the corkboard at the post office, right between a lost dog poster and an ad for cheap firewood. She taped the next to the glass door of the diner. When she walked into Miller's hardware store, the bell above the door jingled, drawing the eyes of 3 men leaning against the fertilizer bags. Miller looked at the flyer, then at Cora. $15 a plate, Cora? You serving those crippled birds you dragged out of the auction? I am, Cora said. She didn't blink. 7 o'clock, Miller. Bring cash. She turned and walked out. She could hear the muffled laughter before the door even swung shut. By Thursday, the anxiety set in. It was a cold, acidic knot in her stomach. She had butchered 25 birds. It had taken her all day, her hands cramping in the freezing water as she cleaned and prepped the carcasses. If nobody showed up, she wouldn't just be humiliated. She would be completely, totally broke. She spent Friday morning clearing out the old tractor barn. She swept decades of dust and dried oil dry from the cracked concrete. She dragged out 3 long, splintered work tables and covered them with cheap white butcher paper. She scavenged every mismatched folding chair she could find on the property. For lighting, she strung up 3 heavy-duty yellow construction lamps from the rafters. It wasn't rustic chic. It was a garage. At 5 o'clock, She fired up 3 cast-iron skillets over butane camping burners she'd set up on a stainless steel workbench. Outside, it began to rain. A cold, miserable November drizzle that turned her dirt driveway into a slick chute of brown mud. At 6:45, she stood alone in the cavernous barn. The smell of rendering bacon fat, buttermilk, and black pepper was intoxicating, heavy enough to chew. But the silence outside was deafening, just the steady drumming of rain on the tin roof. "You're a fool," the cynical voice in her head whispered. "You bet the farm on a flock of trash." Then, a flash of yellow light swept across the wet window pane. Tires crunched on gravel. An engine idled, then died. A car door slammed. Cora wiped her greasy hands on her apron and stepped toward the barn doors. It was Mayor Higgins and his wife. They stepped inside, shaking the rain from their coats, looking around the stark, brightly lit barn with polite hesitation. "Saw the flyer," Higgins said, clearing his throat. "Smells good in here, Cora." "Have a seat, Mayor." "Anywhere you like," Cora said, her voice steady despite the hammering in her chest. 10 minutes later, another truck pulled up. 2 farmhands from the dairy co-op. Then Miller walked in, carrying a 6-pack of cheap lager. He looked around the drafty barn, shivering slightly, but the smell coming from the skillets drew him toward the tables like a magnet. By 7:15, there were 18 people in the barn. It wasn't a crowd, but it was enough to cover her costs. Then, the heavy rumble of a diesel engine shook the walls. Harlan Tate's pristine, lifted silver pickup parked right by the door. Harlan stepped out, wearing a waterproof canvas jacket that cost more than Cora's entire flock. He walked in, his heavy boots echoing on the concrete. He surveyed the mismatched chairs, the butcher paper, the construction lights. A smirk played at the corner of his mouth. "Well," Harlan boomed, making sure the room heard him. "I had to see it for myself. Let's see what a $20 flock tastes like. Put me down for a plate, Cora." He sat at the end of a table, arms crossed, waiting for the circus to begin. Cora didn't say a word to him. She turned back to her skillets. She plated the food on heavy, chipped stoneware plates she'd washed the night before. A massive thigh and leg quarter for each plate. A scoop of mashed potatoes grown in her own dirt, drenched in the dark, peppery pan drippings. A side of braised mustard greens, cooked down with ham hocks. She carried the plates out 3 at a time. She set one down in front of Harlan. The chicken didn't look like the golden, perfectly uniform, heavily battered spheres served at the drive-thru. The crust was dark, jagged, and aggressively textured. The meat pulled back slightly from the bone, revealing the thick, dark muscle beneath. The barn went quiet. The only sound was the scrape of forks and the rain on the roof. Miller took the first bite. He had picked up a drumstick. He bit into the crust. The crunch was audible across the room. He stopped. He didn't chew. He just sat there for a long 3 seconds, staring at the wall. Then he looked down at the meat in his hand. He took another bite, pulling a long strip of dark meat off the bone. Down the table, Mayor Higgins's wife was ignoring her fork entirely, tearing into a breast piece with her bare hands, grease shining on her chin. Cora stood by the burners, her arms crossed, watching Harlan Tate. Harlan picked up his chicken quarter. He looked at it skeptically. He took a small testing bite of the skin. He froze. Cora watched the mechanics of his face shift. The smirk vanished. His jaw worked slowly as he processed the flavor. The deep, earthy richness. The tight, demanding texture of a bird that had run, fought, and lived outside. The dense, savory punch of the fat. Harlan didn't look up. He didn't say a word. He just lowered his head and systematically dismantled the chicken quarter. He ate the potatoes. He ate the greens. He stripped the bones entirely clean, leaving nothing but cartilage. When he was done, He sat back in his chair. He wiped his hands on a cheap paper napkin. He finally looked up and met Cora's eyes across the room. He didn't offer a compliment. He didn't apologize. But as he stood up, he pulled a $50 bill from his money clip, tossed it onto the grease-stained butcher paper, and walked out into the rain. Miller leaned back, exhaling a long breath. He looked at Cora. "I'll be damned," he whispered. That night, Cora counted the crumpled bills on her kitchen table. $340. It was the most money she had held in her hands in 2 years. It started as a slow burn. Word of mouth in Oakhaven didn't travel on the internet. It traveled in the aisles of the feed store, across the hoods of pickup trucks, and over the counter at the diner. "Have you been out to the Vance place? You gotta try that chicken. It ain't normal. It tastes like the chicken my grandma used to make before the factories took over." The next Friday, 30 people showed up. Cora had to borrow a 4th skillet. The Friday after that, 50 people arrived. Cars parked along the grass of her driveway. She ran out of chicken by 8 o'clock and had to turn away 10 people. By March, the frost broke and the orchard began to bud. Cora's checking account no longer hovered near zero. She had replaced the rotted water pump. She had bought proper fencing. But she had a problem. She only had 60 birds left. She knew the math. If she wanted to scale, she needed more volume. Harlan Tate's model dictated cramming 10,000 birds into a shed, feeding them engineered soy, and slaughtering them in 6 weeks. Cora went back to the auction barn. She didn't buy prime stock. She waited for the culls. When Lot 42 rolled out, another 400 battered, sickly runts rejected by the hatcheries, she raised her paddle. She bought them for $25. She brought them home. She dumped them in the dirt. She let the weak die, and she let the strong adapt. She capped her suppers at 75 plates a week. She charged $30 a head. People complained about the price hike right up until they took their first bite. Then they shut up and handed over their cash. By June, things had shifted entirely. It was a warm Friday evening. Cora stood in the barn, now outfitted with a massive commercial fryer she'd bought at a restaurant supply liquidation. She was sliding flour-dredged quarters into the rolling oil when she heard the honking. She stepped out the side door and looked down her driveway. There was a line. A literal line of cars stretching all the way down the quarter-mile dirt track, spilling out onto the county highway. There were rusted farm trucks, mixed in with gleaming SUVs bearing license plates from the city, 2 hours away. A food critic from a regional magazine had showed up unannounced 3 weeks prior. He wrote an article titled, "The Ghost of American Poultry Lives," in a drafty barn in Oakhaven. Now the city folks were coming. They wore expensive denim and clean boots, standing in the dust, drinking warm beer, waiting for a plate of food cooked on folding tables. Cora watched them for a moment. Her back ached. Her forearms were peppered with tiny burn scars from popping grease. She wiped sweat from her forehead and went back inside. At 9 o'clock, the "Sold Out" sign went up. The remaining cars turned around, disappointed, but promising to come earlier next week. Cora was scrubbing down the prep tables when a shadow fell across the concrete. Harlan Tate stood in the doorway. He didn't have his usual swagger. The massive commercial poultry market had taken a hit recently. Feed prices had skyrocketed, and a mild respiratory bug had swept through his densely packed barns, forcing him to cull thousands of birds for zero profit. "Evening, Cora," Harlan said, his voice quieter than she remembered. "We're out of food, Harlan. Didn't come to eat." He stepped into the barn, looking at the commercial fryer, the stacks of plates, the empty folding chairs. "I came to make a proposition." Cora stopped scrubbing. She leaned against the stainless steel sink. "Listening. I've got 3 empty barns on the south side of my property," Harlan said. He hooked his thumbs into his belt loops. Climate-controlled, automated feeders. I want a partner. You bring your... whatever it is you do to the meat. The recipe, the breeding line, whatever secret feed ratio you're using. We scale it. We can put out 5,000 of these birds a month. Slap an heritage label on them, sell them to the city restaurants for $50 a pop. We split it 60-40. You take the 40. Cora stared at him. She thought about the money. It would be life-changing. She could pave the driveway. She could fix the roof on her house. She wouldn't have to haul bags of spent grain in the freezing rain. There's no secret feed ratio, Harlan, Cora said flatly. Harlan frowned. Don't play coy, Cora. Meat doesn't taste like that on accident. It's not an accident. It's the dirt, Cora said. She gestured toward the open barn doors, out toward the dark expanse of the orchard. It's the bugs. It's the wild garlic. It's the fact that they have to run and dig and survive. It takes them 6 months to reach butchering weight. Your barns take 6 weeks. So we tweak the timeline, Harlan argued. We give them a little more space. We put a dirt floor in one of the sheds. You don't get it, Cora said, shaking her head. You can't industrialize survival. You can't put my birds in a cage and expect them to taste like freedom. Harlan stared at her, frustrated. You're turning down a gold mine, Cora. You can't feed the world out of an old tractor barn. I'm not trying to feed the world, Harlan, Cora said softly, turning back to the sink. I'm just trying to feed my town. And right now, there's a line out to the highway for my culls, and your prime stock is sitting in a freezer. She picked up her scrub brush. Now, if you'll excuse me. I've got crates to wash. I'm going to the auction tomorrow morning. Harlan stood there for a long moment. He looked at the stacks of empty plates. He looked at the grease on Cora's apron. For the first time in his life, the biggest man in Oak Haven had nothing to say. He turned and walked out into the warm summer night. Cora finished scrubbing the tables. She turned off the heavy yellow construction lights, plunging the barn into shadows. She walked outside. The night air was cool, smelling of damp earth and crushed apple leaves. From the far edge of the orchard, she heard the low, rhythmic clucking of her flock settling into the lower branches of the trees. The crooked, the bald, the rejects. Cora smiled, the tired lines around her eyes softening in the moonlight. She shoved her hands into the pockets of her frayed denim jacket and walked back toward the farmhouse. She had a lot of work to do tomorrow. Cora Vance proved that real value isn't about looking perfect on paper. It's about resilience, hard work, and knowing your worth when everyone else calls you a fool. Harlan Tate's millions couldn't buy the one thing Cora built from scratch, a soul. If you were inspired by Cora's grit, hit that like button, share this story with someone building their own dream, and subscribe to the channel for more underdog stories. What's your crooked chicken project? Tell us below.